All right, welcome everybody to Plan/Geography 450 at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment. My name is Marcus Mose. I'm assistant professor in the School of Planning, and I'm very happy to announce our guest speaker, or introduce our guest speaker today, Sean Hurdle, who is a planning consultant and owns his own planning consulting firm. Sean was a long-term, I think, employee at York Region as a planner, and he's a professional registered planner with the OPPI and CIP. He has degrees in urban studies and in environmental studies from York University. He did his master's there, and was working with Roger Kyle, who's leading a large-scale global project on global suburbanisms that we've heard about and talked about a little bit in this class. Okay. And so, Sean's work and thinking about suburbs very closely connects to the things we've been reading and talking about, sort of these new ways of needing to think about suburbs, not just as places, but also as suburbanization as a process and suburban ways of living, right, as suburbanisms. And so what does that do for us as planners in terms of being able to understand suburbs in new ways? So really this is one of those neat opportunities where we're really trying to connect theory to practice, and we're also seeing, hopefully today, or hopefully you can see how a practicing planner is grappling with these very conceptual and theoretical concepts. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sean Hurdle to the class today.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. So guys, can you hear me all right? I'm usually not told that I'm not heard, so this is okay? Just let me know. All right, thanks very much for having me. And so suburbs, beyond myth and stereotype and into the urban. It sounds like a Star Trek episode. But anyway, this is a bit of an odyssey because I want to take us beyond the prototypical, sort of stereotypical, run-of-the-mill thinking about suburbs, both in the public discourse and as professional and budding professional planners and students of planning and geography and disciplines related to and a part of the urban or the suburban and aspects of those things. And I really want you to think about it with me a little bit differently, if you will. And it's not a judgment on whether the suburb or suburbanisms and different processes are good or bad from a normative perspective. I'm just talking about from a concept of reality. What are they? What is this thing that's already here? And the instrument of planning that we have to deal with as planners. So think of it as an object and a subject of investigation, if you can, okay? So suburbs are really the entry points into the urban world, and just in both physical and emotional terms. And I know that might sound a little bit psychological or philosophical, but let me bear with you of personal experience. Growing up in the 70s and early 80s, I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, and there was not much going on then as there is now. And our big city was Detroit, and it was dying and dying for decades, even in the 70s. And so we went to visit family in Toronto. But family for me in Toronto, they were in Mississauga, Streetsville at the time. They were in Oshawa. They were in a little village called Newmarket. So going to them, and I remember sitting in the back seat of our Chevy Nova, and I could hear the tick-tock of the pavement on the 401, and I knew that we were getting close to Toronto because you move from pavement to concrete, and you could hear the seams in the street, tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. And then you can get a sense of the hum of the city, what I called the city, but we were really in the suburbs. And pulling into the driveways of the single detached homes and going up the old 60s area apartment buildings in Mississauga, I got a sense of an energy, of a buzz that I identified with instantly as Toronto, even though it was considered a suburb, especially then a bedroom community. And you could hear the buzz of the traffic, and you would go upstairs to the coffee table and you would see the big thick telephone book, and that signaled that you were in a different world. I was somehow in Toronto, even though I knew geographically, politically, municipally, from a boundary perspective, I was actually in the suburb. But to me, it didn't matter because I knew I was in some place different. Whether you called it a city or a suburb or Mississauga or Streetsville or Toronto or North York, it didn't matter. And 40 years later, now I want you to, I still hold true to that, thinking about the urban, the city, the suburb in that way, as a 4-year-old in the back of a Nova on the way to Streetsville. I recognize it as a city, and I still do, and I kind of want to share why that is. And I want to invite you to discuss that with me. Okay, so suburbs are loved, they're despised for obvious and not so obvious reasons, okay? They're the solution and a problem for planners. But they're the majority of where urban dwellers actually live and work. Okay, so that's a reality. And they also pose a political problem because traditionally political capital and the money has been directed to city centers, but the social and economic gravities of urban regions has shifted away, outward to the periphery. Politics are increasingly now reflecting this shift and aligning with this suburban ascendancy. You'll notice that we're in a federal election year, and you'll notice that federal ridings have been added. Most of those, and I think without exception, all of those ridings are within what we would call a suburban area. So what does that mean, right? That translates into an increasing political power. But anecdotally, look at the papers, look where the money is being invested. Traditionally, city centers, okay? So think about that sort of disconnect, if you will, okay? So what happened in 2008? And I'm not inviting any temptation for any lurid stories. You could tell me about those after. But does anybody know, right off the top, what happened in 2008?
Recession.
Yes? Related to that, planners were talking about a formative event, a watershed event, somewhat related and perhaps magnified by a recession. I'll tell you, for the first time, the World Bank and IMF and statisticians everywhere said, as of this moment, I think it happened late in the year, half of the world's population was considered to be urban dwellers, living in urban areas. For the first time since we were keeping track of such things. And historically, we know that people traditionally were rural agrarian people, right? Not city dwellers, certainly. So for the first time, we become an urban world. But I challenge that because the scholarship is actually saying, a lot of geographers and a lot of planners are saying, well, actually, it's a suburban world because about 75%, or at least a great majority of that quote-unquote urban population is actually living in what we would call or describe to be suburban areas. And in fact, you may have heard the study by David Gordon from Queen's University 2 years ago, in 2013. He did a study of 33 census metropolitan areas, CMAs, in Canada, and he looked at the spatial distribution of population throughout those CMAs and said, well, actually, we would consider about 2/3 of the Canadian urban population, which is about 80%. So 2/3 of that is actually what we would be calling people living in the suburban area, the suburban bands around cities. So if Canada is 80% urban, but 2/3 of that is actually suburban, you could say that we are a suburban nation as part of a suburban world. What are the implications of that? What made it that way? What are the implications for planning? What are the implications for economics, for social structures, for the economy? Think about it. What are the prospects of achieving notable goals, such as addressing climate change, healthy lifestyles, social equity, social justice, moving away from auto-based transportation? What are the implications of that? Important questions we need to be asking. But we have to first realize what the milieu of planning is, that it's actually suburban. And we're not making a value judgment, but we have to accept it for what it is. So where is this? Sort of a trick question, but does anybody know? Yeah, it doesn't really matter, does it? Okay, no offense to the intersection of of Yonge Street and Davis Drive in the town of Newmarket in suburban Toronto. This is about 40 minutes with no traffic north of Toronto. In York Region, my office was just down the street. This could be anywhere, and I think that's sort of the point that I want to make with this photo. This is typical, prototypical suburban development, wide right-of-way, the sidewalks way out here, traffic lights, clearly auto-dominated. I think I'll give you $100. I'm just kidding for if you notice a pedestrian. That type of, okay, so you get the idea, okay? This is really the urban, right? We call it suburban. It's a suburban, it could be anywhere, but this is really the city, right? It really is, like if I was a 4-year-old back in my 4-year-old self and looked at this, oh, this is Toronto. This is, doesn't matter politically where it is. It's part of the city fabric, right? So a lot of planning instruments, if you're familiar with, obviously, the Planning Act, the Provincial Policy Statement, the PPS, Places to Grow legislation, the Big Move, various political instruments, planning instruments aimed at intervening in the planning and development continuum of the Greater Toronto and Greater Golden Horseshoe as part of, Waterloo is a part of, is made to change this, to somehow make this quote-unquote more urban, to quote-unquote fix it, okay? To make it more transit-oriented development, to make it more compact, to make it more mixed use, and quite frankly, a lot nicer looking. All good goals, all noble goals, but we have to first recognize what this is all about before I think we would put our collective efforts into changing it. Because I think we have to understand what it is we're acting upon, okay? And understand how it was built. If we don't look at first understanding the mechanisms that created that which we want to change, how successful will we be? And to what end? Okay? So as a regional planner for York Region, this intersection, trying to flip, was part of my, within my project area. And we engaged architects to say, well, we're having a multi-billion-dollar investment in rapid transit. Here's the Viva bus rapid transit network station, which is under construction right now, actually, okay? This is an urban growth center under the growth plan. What would this intersection look like if we intensified mid-rise, mixed use? Sidewalk moves from here to here, which is great. There's still a bit of a swale here. But they're actually starting to construct this right now. And then ultimately, say this is 2031, you would get a different type of cross-section, more urban city. And there are plans on the books. The zoning bylaw does now, I think, permit this. This is about a 2.5 floor space index. You're getting about approximately 200 people and jobs per hectare in this area. But certain things need to happen for this to be realized, right? There are certain externalities that need to meld with planning instruments, zoning bylaws, et cetera, design guidelines to make this happen. Economic forces, right? Social expectations, demand side and supply side, government structures, aspects about what the public realm and public space is versus expectations, traditional suburban expectations about space, how it's manufactured and how it's used, how it's recognized. These things don't happen instantaneously. As much as we like to think as planners, a plan does not mean that it's going to happen, even though in the normative we think it should, but we have to understand processes in place. So, like any good researcher, I typed in suburbs into Google, and I was curious, right? Because suburb is a very subjective term. It means different things to different people. And it spits out the typical stuff. Single family homes, spaghetti streets, cul-de-sacs, garage-scapes. I swear if aliens came there, they'd think that cars were the primary inhabitants of Earth and we were mere subordinates or the servants to the automobiles, because the auto is very prominent even in the design of where we live, which is really interesting. I find that very dark, but no one really talks about that. So we're already coming up against, I hope that I've described that the suburb really is the city in real time in a way, right? It's a part of the urban whether we like it or not. It's what we're building. It's what's happening. It's what we're dealing with. And yet when Google thinks, oh, what's a suburb, it spits this out. It doesn't recognize the complexity of the fact that 2/3 of the urban dwelling population of Canada and probably large parts of the world live. It boils it down to this monolithic simplicity, this homogeneity, and it's saying, well, if the form must be like this, then it must be very simple. Then the ways of life must be similarly very non-complex and very homogeneous, and that's just not the case. So what is a suburb really? I like these. I threw up a few definitions that I really find are quite interesting. It's a junction of ideas, dystopias, and stereotypes. I'd say it is. It's a residential district on the edge of a city or town. That's interesting. That we assume that suburbs are primarily residential and that they're on the edge of something. Okay. Peripheral urban, residential, and economic growth. I prefer that definition. And the word urban is there, if you notice. I'm sorry, I moved too far away. Peripheral urban, residential, and economic growth. Urban. It is urban development. It's on the periphery. It's on the edge. It's city development in real time. Cities just don't grow and stop. Just like cells in our body, like the mitochondria, they keep dividing and keep moving outward, keep recreating themselves. Cities as organisms are no different, right? They shouldn't be. If they did, we'd be in a lot of trouble. So I prefer this definition because it implies that it's in real time and that it's very concentric and it just keeps moving and replicating across the landscape. I'm not saying it's not a value judgment. It's not good or bad. It's just reality. So in seeking to know the suburb for what it is, I think that we need to put on 3 lenses or have 3 perspectives. Obviously, we've got physical form covered. It's what most everyone's preoccupied with. It's what Google is preoccupied with, okay? Even though I think physical form is a lot more complex in suburbs today, especially since in leading up to the advent of the growth plan. Through smart growth, we have mid-rise development, we have neo-traditional suburban development. Whether or not that's just sort of a new skinning of suburban sprawl or whatever, that's a whole other lecture, but at least it's evolving. It's a little more complex than it used to be. The suburb is a process, the process of suburbanization. There are mechanisms at play that make it what it is, both internal and external. And it's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. Suburbanism, it's a thing. It's already a little more complex. This is what everyone sort of identifies with, the suburb. This is a fairly new development in the city of Markham, about half an hour from that first intersection that I showed you. This is a fairly affluent area, and these are probably about 1 million, 1.2 million. And they literally build hundreds of these things. And this is pretty prototypical suburban development, but it's not completely representative of what's being built. But I think it's what people think in the imaginary of what suburban development is. Okay? But there are other forms. I took this photo. I was coming in for a landing in Pearson, and this really shows the true actual complexity of the suburban band, especially across the GTA, that my colleague and I, Chris Hardwick, have written about and called hyperbia, because it's a meld of suburban and urban forms. It's not completely suburban, it's not completely city or urban in a traditional sense. You can see the downtown, you can see bands of transit-oriented development. You can look at this and you can almost tell where the subway stations and bus stations are, can't you? We have 60s and 70s area apartment blocks found only in the North American suburbs, generally in Toronto and other parts of Europe. And then we see single-family homes interspersed. So this is quite an eclectic mix. This is a brand of suburbanism that really exists nowhere else in the world. So we've called it suburbia. It's a little more complex than that first photo of those back-allotted homes. Here's another example. This is Los Angeles. It looks fairly similar, doesn't it, to Toronto? And it's no mistake. This is what suburban scholar or urban scholar, but he's kind of a suburb expert, Ed Soja from UCLA, calls metropolitan urbanization. And it's a new scale of city building. And scholars, including Ed Soja, have said, this is the post-suburban reality. This is post-suburbanization. The suburb has gone from a separate entity to a part of the urban. It's morphed into something that it wasn't supposed to morph to. It is not separate from the city, it's a part of the city now. At the beginning I talked a little bit about a shift of gravity, right? This reflects the shift of gravity. The scale, the center of gravity in cities have shifted to the periphery, both in social and economic and physical terms. And it's being called metropolitan urbanization. And I think that's happening in the Greater Toronto Area. We just label it differently because it's a result of different processes that have changed since the first sort of prototypical suburbs have developed in Levittown and Don Mills in the 40s and 50s. Okay? Here are some more examples of suburbs to challenge our notion of what a physical construct of a suburb should be. These are slubs. These are slums. I bet you a lot of that, half of that world urban population actually live in areas like this around cities like Mumbai and Sao Paulo, Mexico City. This is something that you would probably see outside Tokyo, Hong Kong. This is tracked higher density housing built across Europe. So suburb is a process. Suburbanization, it's capitalistic accumulation. It's the market at work, right? Much like consumerism or I grew up outside at assembly plants in Windsor. It's standardization, mechanization, commoditization, and it's a scaling up of things, consumer preferences and production. It's a growth machine, UCLA economist Logan and Molach, right? It's an extension and it's an apparition of the economy. It's a product of three modalities of governance. Governance is a fancy word for processes, okay? Mechanisms. There's the state, government, okay? So you could say that the growth plan and the planning act as planners, that's a part of state mechanisms of governing planning, okay? Capitalist accumulation is a fancy term for the market, okay? So what people, supply size, what people say they want, what they need. Single family home or a condo or these are consumer preferences. These are manifested in capitalistic accumulation. Okay? They are delivered through these mechanisms. In privatized authoritarianism, this is sort of this sinister process wherein we move from public expressions of civic discourse and expectations of open space to more of an intrinsic, private-looking perspective and value projections of what the city, what the public realm should be. So we go from the outside, from public realms, streets, transit, civic squares, going to public schools, identifying with the larger thing, to inward identification in terms of my lot, my car, my driveway, my big screen TV, user pay, and all these different projections of expectations about what the urban environment should be. And they manifest most poignantly in gated communities, but they manifest in many other ways as well. So the sum of these three forces produces what we see coming across the landscape. And it's incumbent on planners to understand, beyond our own mechanisms of zoning bylaws and official plans and design charrettes, these forces acting on us, pressing down on our planning instruments and societal expectations and expectations from a normative perspective of what planners think the public interest is, what good planning is. So we have to understand that these things are acting upon us. And they are, whether we like it or not, sort of our dance partners. And we have to exist that these things work in order for us to intervene and appropriate them for achieving what we think good planning should be. Suburb as a way of life, suburbanism. And I love this quote. This was written basically 50 years ago, okay? S.D. Clark is a sociologist that was one of the first sociologists to study suburbs beyond built form in the 60s. And I don't think we've caught up with them still. He says critics would be expected to ask the question whether the lives of the people in the suburbs were really as they were made out to be. And I don't think we've really asked. People actually live there. These aren't just wide streets and cars and garage-scapes. People live there. 2/3 of the Canadian urban population live in suburbs, but we discount that people live there. There are lives made there. We have to understand what's going on. Because do planners plan for buildings, or do we plan for people? Do we plan for ways of life? Do we plan for lived experiential outcomes? And I would say it's the latter. And quite frankly, I think it needs to be the latter. Okay? Moving along, I love this. This is a 60s, 70s area commercial plaza on Albion Road in suburban Rexdale, northern Etobicoke, near the airport in Toronto. Does anybody recognize this space here on the right?
Is that Yonge and Dundas Square?
You got it. This is Yonge and Dundas Square, okay? So what's going on here? What's happening? I took these on the same day, these pictures, okay? Same day. This was taken in February of 2011. You see mom and pop owned shops. These are obviously, not quote unquote, blue blood Canadian establishments, okay? There's a mix of shops, there's clothing, there's a place to get fresh baked bread, and there's a seamstress, dry cleaners. And look here, what's happening. You see a bit of almost like an impromptu bazaar spilling out of the parking lot. Very improvised. That's pretty cool. It's very organic. What's happening here? Here we see very corporate landscape. We see surveillance. There are private security guards roaming around. This is a heavily surveilled space, heavily commoditized, commercialized. We got billboards a la Times Square. We have corporate chains everywhere. And what are these people doing in this public square? You probably can't see, but they're actually lining up for promotion. They're lining up to get free samples of toilet paper. Okay, so what's more urban, right? What's more urban? This could maybe be a little bit more urban form, but I would challenge you to say that this is actually more urban than that. That you could actually say that Yonge and Dundas Square is actually a very highly suburbanized space. Not because of its form, but by its formation. By its capitalistic accumulation, by its heavily commoditized nature, by its surveillance, by its commercialism, by people lining up for free samples of goods. Whereas here in this suburban landscape, you have privately owned shops. You have improvised urbanism. You have a bazaar spilling out in the parking lot. You have mix. You have erratic behavior. Isn't that urban? So what I'm saying very windedly is that urban form is not a predeterminant, does not preordain lifestyle. You could have a, quote, urban lifestyle, whatever that is, in a suburban area, and you could live a very suburban lifestyle in a city if you want. Can't you? There are people that cycle to work in the suburbs, and there are people that drive to work in the city. Just really quickly, as Marcus mentioned, Marcus and I are both a part of a kind of a landmark, a land-breaking, first of its kind, international collaborative research initiative housed at York University, and I'm really happy to have a very, very small part of it. studying different forms of suburbanization and suburbanisms around the world. 50 researchers, quite a budget. I think it's the largest humanities research grant in Canadian history to look at suburbs. It's really landmark. And while people are flying all over the world, and I think 14 countries, I've been given Toronto to look at. But that's okay. And so I had the privilege of coordinating, thank you for that, for coordinating the Greater Toronto Suburban Working Group, the GTSWG. We pulled together all kinds of different people who usually wouldn't speak to each other in a room to talk about suburbs, and to talk about suburbs as they are, not necessarily the way they should be. Okay? How are they lived? What are the different mechanisms? What are the governance forces at play making the suburbs the way they are? Because if we want to change them, we have to first understand how they are in the first place, right? If we're going to intervene upon them, right? So we want to talk much in the vein of Patsy Healy. I don't know if you've looked at Patsy Healy in your planning theory courses, but she talked about this communicative turn in planning, right? We are the stories we tell. Planning through talking, and I'm kind of a huggy guy, so I kind of like Patsy Healy's thing. So we tried to do that, tell stories to each other and learn from each other. Very experiential, okay? And I think that that's probably the better way to get to know the suburb. And so we wanted to share knowledge, share different knowledges, different perspectives. We had environmentalists with development professionals around the same table, and believe me, that was really interesting. Okay, but we talked, and it was great because we weren't abiding by positions. We just shared our experiences. And here's some of we had 10 partners, municipalities, NGOs, United Way, Neptus Foundation, Greenbelt, prominent urban design firms like Urban Strategies and Dialogue, Canadian Urban Institute, the development industry decided by Build. We all were around the table. And it was the conversations were really fantastic. And we talked about all kinds of themes that you would see, the kind of the usual suspects. Talked a lot about the growth plan, the Greenbelt plan, why it's good, why it's bad, why could it change, etc. Infrastructure, aging. This is a new one. Ways of life. We said, how the suburbs really experience needs to be talked a little bit more, needs to be better understood. Much like Samuel Dilbert Clark said almost 50 years ago, right? Community services. Suburbs have city problems. Homelessness is just as much an issue in an affluent suburb like Oakville or Markham as it is in downtown Toronto, Yonge Dundas Square. It's just more invisible. Okay? Transportation and then Greenbelt and the environment. Usual suspects. Okay? So we want to learn from each other, and here are a few things that we sort of accepted as new truths. Okay? Suburbs are the new city, but maybe of a new sort, right? Like a regional city. As Sojik talked about this metropolitan scale of urbanization. It's a city in real time. We need new processes. The governance mechanisms acting on suburbs have generally been unchanged for decades, and yet we all expect different results. We want more livable communities, communities that will allow people to age in place and have social services nearby, but we really haven't changed the way we deliver services. That needs to change, okay? Suburbs are no place to grow old. This is a kind of a crisis point here. No one's really talking about it, and I think we need to. Okay? How is somebody in a walker going to cross a 45-meter, 7-lane cross-section of a regional road? Think about that original intersection, Yonge and Davis Drive. How is somebody going to get across there in a blinking hand of 17 seconds? It's not going to happen. We have to think about these things. Okay? Suburban ways of life don't comply with stereotypes. And somewhat provocatively, we've offered that the city needs the suburbs probably more than the suburbs need the city probably more than you know what I'm saying. The city needs the suburbs more than the suburbs need the city. Got it. Okay. And we make some recommendations. We have a roundtable report. I've got references, because I know you're really excited about, we've got references at the back of the presentation, so all this is linked. And we have a recommendation report called our roundtable report. There's me and my shiny head, and this is what we look about. We go around to different people's offices. We take over and eat their food and talk about suburbs. Okay? And this is our roundtable report, and we have our recommendations summarized in there. Some of the recommendations is we want to view the suburbs as they are before intervening, okay? Suburbs in real life in real time. We have to link urban expansions more closely with intensification targets. So if we want actual change to happen, we've got to enforce the rules that we have in place, okay? And we need to, I know this is an oxymoron, but can we plan for flexibility? Suburbs, traditional suburbs are made as end states, right? They're made as things, as end products, not really meant to change at all, but they have to change. People are getting old, our communities are getting more diverse, people have more complex needs. So can we plan for flexibility? We need to try. We need to focus on social inclusion. We need to have more urban infrastructure standards, okay? We have to, and I'm looking at you guys, we have to keep younger residents in these communities. Because if we're just exporting talent from suburbs, what are the long-term social and economic prospects for these places? Okay? And we're talking about, I don't really understand this, but our group, there's some data experts, and they say, look, we need to move to an open data, open government system. We need to liberate the data. We need to share information. We need to standardize data a little bit more to enable our understanding of suburbs. So what we're doing now is the GTSWG, and we thought that we have a new acronym after 3 years, but that hasn't happened. So we're taking our show on the road. This is part of why I'm here today, is to tell you about what we're doing. We want to inspire others to talk about the suburbs, talk about them as they are, and then act, right, and do something about it, mobilize, okay? So we're working on a bit of a recipe card to say, okay, we think that we've created a really interesting forum to talk about suburbs. How can we have other people steal our ideas and do it? And we'd like to see similar forums in cities in like Montreal and Vancouver, Calgary, and even across the United States. So we think people can benefit from it. And the province is interested in our work, and they're going to incorporate some of our recommendations and discussions into the review of the growth plan, the Greenbelt plan, and some of their other legislation as part of their 10-year review, which is going to be happening about now. Okay? And here, pretty much everything that I've talked about is referenced here. All the papers, I've done my best to include some hyperlinks. And these aren't, generally canons in the discourse of suburban planning, and that's why I kind of threw them in there, to maybe broaden the perspective, and you can familiarize yourself with some new literatures. And here's some contact information if you want to continue the conversation. I'd be all too happy to talk to you about it, because I'm learning all the time too, and I think I need to. So thanks very much. That's it.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. That was amazing. A really interesting insight into how we can think about suburbs and suburbanisms as ways of living, and suburbanization as a process in very different ways than I think we're accustomed to, both in the scholarly and the practical realm. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and so I'm going to come around and hand the microphone to people. So I'll go to Veronica first back here.
Hi, you said that you wanted to keep younger people in suburbs. What recommendations do you have to do such a thing?
Okay, well, the group, we had a lot of urban designers on the GTSWG, and the first thing that they said is we need a higher quality public realm. We need both, I guess, public and quasi-public. So we need, I know this might sound like a broken record, but coffee shops and gatherings places. I'm sorry, you're laughing, getting a lot of reaction, but places to gather, more interesting places that they could see themselves living in. Okay, different from the single-family home, more interaction, a little more excitement, and through open data and other technologies, if suburbs can sort of seize upon wiring themselves in literally and figuratively into the larger world, maybe the chances of keeping creative capital in cities and their municipalities would be greater. A lot of municipalities are going after, they want to become satellite campuses, for example, for universities and colleges. They want to house R&D institutes. So they understand that they need to tap into the knowledge economy and to take their fair share, because generally talent goes to cities. Not to sound like Richard Florida, but there is some truth to that, right? So municipalities in the suburban and the peripheral regions of cities want to capitalize on that. Does that answer your question? Is that okay?
I know you talked about how people view suburbs, and that 2/3 of the Canadian population live in these areas. So I was interested to know why you think it's taking so long for people to kind of view suburbs as they are, rather than the stereotypical kind of, residential maze.
I think because it's kind of fun too, to be honest. It's sort of sporting. In a way, you think about it, I'm being very honest. I mean, sometimes you see a Home Depot, like, that's an abomination. That's horrible. That's, oh my God, as they're driving to it. You know what I mean? So, right? And I'm guilty of it too. So I think it's fun. It's the popular thing to do. One kind of counter anecdote that I heard at one of our GTSWG forums, one of my favorites, is that kind of a downtown elitist type writer, who I won't mention their name, but they said, you know what? I love food, and food explains it really, really well. They said, the food is better in the suburbs. Okay? The rents are generally cheaper. That's where all the new immigrants, the newcomers to Canada are coming. Those restaurants are awesome. That's where all the chefs are coming. But the atmosphere sucks. So you go to the suburb for the food, and you go to downtown or the city for the atmosphere to be seen, right? And I think that really sums it up. And I think if you look at popular culture, television shows, I mean, a lot of these Leave It to Beaver stereotypes are still pervasive, not because they're true, but because they've been so strong and they're so polarizing that people can instantly identify them. Right? And so people that want to tell a certain story, that want to abide by a certain narrative, all you have to do is lead with one of those stereotypes, and then the rest of the story just writes itself. Right? And I think that's a large part of it. Suburbs aren't sexy. And a lot of issues in perceived and actual in suburbs aren't very visible because of, for many reasons, but it's a different form. Things are more spread out. There's more diffusion in terms of social interplay that is related to physical space, physical separation as well. Okay? And I think that technology is slowly starting to minimize those social and physical distances, but we're still catching up. Does that make sense? I think that these strong stereotypes really hold true. That's why we haven't really recognized it.
So, in particular to the GTA, the suburbs are really ethnically diverse. I wonder how's the discussion been in terms of the origins of these cultures, and how different from each other.
Oh, so is your question is how these newcomers perceive where they live? Or?
Yeah, well, you mentioned there's a lot of conversations about these suburbs. So I wonder how much, is there a lot of study on the origins of these cultures?
Yeah, we have had, I haven't studied it myself, but we have had, as part of the Greater Toronto Suburban Working Groups, we've had some exchange students join our group from other countries, and have actually done research on what I get in scholarship they call ethnoburbs, various concentrations of ethnic groups in the suburban periphery, to look at the dynamism behind those places and why they are the way they are, and how they react to their surroundings and how they're integrating into the fabric. Because when someone came to the city 50 years ago, they came to Spadina, Chinese settled in the Spadina corridor, and Greeks settled in the eastern part of the Danforth. And what's happened is that now they go to the suburbs, right? And so now there are many different Greek towns. There are many different China towns. So they have the suburbs have And I think that's one of the reasons to substantiate why the suburb has become the new city, because they've replicated these ethnic concentrations that are always thought to be city neighborhoods or city phenomena. But I will tell you, through talking with social service agencies, newcomers don't feel a lot of connection. They feel connection within their own cultural community in the suburbs, but they don't feel a connection to the larger community. And I'm wondering if that's any different than, say, an Italian family arriving to Toronto in the 50s and 60s. Like, I don't know if it's sort of the same issues replicating themselves, or if because the suburbs are spatially different than the city, is it harder to have a bit of an identity, to quote unquote make it, to feel like you're a part of the larger society beyond your own community? I don't know, but I think there could be some implications there, I think.
Just given changing demographics within Canada, do you see a need for the changing in the housing that's made available within our suburbs going forward?
Short answer, yes. We talked about governance. The market is delivering housing that's not necessarily, they're delivering because it's being sold, okay? But it's not, I would argue that it's not 100% meeting people's needs. You may have heard there's been some really interesting, somewhat sensational stories on housing coming out of Brampton. For example, you have Indian families wanting very, very large homes in areas where it's been zoned for townhouses and smaller. And so they're saying, look, the city is being discriminatory against us because we believe in multifamily, multi-generational living. This, what you're planning for is not is contrary to the needs of your residents. Okay, so I think there are some disconnects. There is a lot of poverty in the suburbs as well. I don't know who's familiar with Vaughan Wonderland. You're going up to 400. You see the amusement park. Okay, you see a lot of single-family homes on either side. Okay, they're very large. You can see, if you see over the privacy walls. And driving by, they look very affluent areas, but that's one of the highest concentrations of poverty in the city of Vaughan and the region of York and the GTA. And you'd never, ever know it to look at it. You have many families living way below the poverty line in these homes. And so the housing masks a lot of these problems. And so maybe if they've had a choice, maybe they live in another type of accommodation. I don't know. Maybe the large home helps them to economize and share and keep costs down. But there's a disconnect, right? The nuclear family is not living in these homes. Okay? Something else has happened. So I think we have to understand that these things are happening, and the market needs to be more responsive. And I think there does need to be an intervention, even if just on the affordability issue. I think we're approaching a crisis point in housing affordability, especially for families. That's a whole other talk, but I think something needs to happen.
Maybe we'll leave it at that note on something does need to happen, right? And there's a lot of your excellent work on this front certainly points to new opportunities for change. Maybe I'll say for the suburbs, with the suburbs, and from the suburbs, as opposed to from the city for the suburbs,
Agreed.
right?
I think we need a suburban-based, not only discourse, as I was saying, but we need solutions bred in the suburbs as well, by the people actually living there, okay? And I think it has to be from the inside out.
Let's thank Sean Hurdle again for taking the time to be here today.